You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nasim Ahmed. We are discussing Palestine Liberation Theology and asking what Jesus would do if he were alive and living in Palestine. Whose side would he be on? It may seem an abstruse question, but to many Palestinian Christians, this is an important topic. Christian liberation theology have inspired anti-colonial movements across the world and forged alliances in fighting oppression and injustice. Could we see similar movements in Palestine, or perhaps one already exists? My guests today are two Christian theologians, who are in fact brothers, John Munayer and Samuel Munayer. Thank you, John. Thank you, Samuel, for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
John is as I said, Palestinian theologian from Jerusalem. He holds a degree from King's College London, the University of Edinburgh, and VU University Amsterdam. He is currently a lecturer at the Bethlehem Bible College and editor of the Journal of Palestinian Christianity. John is also active in several Palestinian Christian initiatives in Palestine. Samuel is a Palestinian theologian also from Jerusalem. After completing a BA in Theology and Philosophy at Durham University, he is now pursuing a master's degree in Middle Eastern politics at Exeter University under the supervision of Professor Ilan Pappe. Samuel recently co-authored an article with John on Palestine Liberation Theology titled Decolonising Palestinian Liberation Theology, New Methods, Sources and Voices. I invited John and Samuel, having had the privilege of listening to their paper, The Palestinian Christ. Now, Samuel delivered the paper at a recent conference in Exeter, and it is one of the winning submissions selected for its excellence and its originality. So I want to again thank them for joining and presenting and talking about the paper with me. I mean, it's quite a complex discussion, so maybe a good place to start is with simple definitions. Samuel, tell us what is liberation theology first, and what is Palestinian liberation theology second?
Yeah, it's a good question. Perhaps I'll break down Palestinian liberation theology in reverse. So I'll first begin with theology. What does theology mean? The definition of theology, it is the study of the Christian faith, at least from a Christian perspective. It is involving the study of God's nature, the relationship between God and humanity, the divinity and human nature of Christ, the authority of the Bible and the tradition. And it can be summarized as in the line of faith-seeking understanding. Now, within theology, you have liberation theology, which is, I guess, a discipline, a category within Christian theology. And liberation theology began or originates in the 1960s in Latin America and then spread globally. And it was a political and social movement advocating for the poor in Latin America. And the main theological arguments for liberation theology is, number one, God has a preferential option for the poor. So the message of Christ, the main focus of God's activity in history is to liberate the oppressed, and therefore the poor and the oppressed, the poor not only speaking economically, have a special preference in regards to God's perspective. Secondly, the kingdom of God is not some future hope that we are to be waiting for, but it is a present reality that we need to be actualizing. We need to realize the present reality of the kingdom of God. Therefore, we need to be active, and we need to manifest and bear witness to God's love, compassion, and care for justice. Thirdly, liberation theology views sin not only as an action of an individual, whether I sin against you, or I sin against God, or I commit some form of idolatry or spiritual sin, but it also sees it within oppressive structures. Therefore, liberation theology sees capitalism as a result of sin. It sees the patriarchy as a result of sin, the white supremacy as a result of sin. Colonialism is a structure of sinfulness. Therefore, because it is a result of sin, it is a manifestation of sin, it must be resisted against. God did not intend for these structures to be in place, and actually is calling people to revolt against it. And lastly is the idea of praxis. So liberation theology critiques traditional theology, which is kind of at times too abstract, confined to the seminary, confined to the academia, to the academic space. But liberation theology stresses the need for involving practice and theology together, political praxis more specifically. And in that sense, we need to do theological reflection with the notion, with the spirit of having a political praxis within it. Indeed, Gustavo Gutierrez, the father of liberation theology in Latin America, says we first need to be politically active, then we need to start thinking and reflecting theologically. So that's kind of liberation theology in general. And it's taken various forms around the world. You have feminist liberation theology, Latin American liberation theology, Black liberation theology, and you have Palestinian liberation theology. And Palestinian liberation theology follows the kind of arguments of liberation theology, but within the Palestinian context. So the poor are the Palestinians. They are the one who are being oppressed. They are the one who need to be liberated. The structure of sin in the Palestinian-Israeli context is Zionism, is the occupation, it's apartheid, and therefore there needs liberation for that. But more than that, Palestinian liberation theology understands the Christian faith, understands the message of liberation from the point of departure of the Palestinian experience. So the way you approach the Bible, the way you approach the Christian faith, your point of departure is your Palestinian experience, the Palestinian identity. And therefore, that's where the Palestinianness comes into Palestinian liberation theology. And the two contextual unique features within Palestinian liberation theology is the focus on the land, which has been weaponized against Palestinians by Christian Zionism and Jewish Zionism as a way of saying that the Jews were promised the land, and therefore there's a justification, a moral, divine justification to oppress Palestinians and to ethnically cleanse them and to carry out the settler colonial project. So therefore the idea of the land is very much present within Palestinian liberation theology and interfaith dialogue, because Christianity, Islam, Judaism, we're all together here in Palestine. We all have shared religious sites, holy sites, shared practices at times. There's a sense of need of interfaith dialogue. And therefore, that's a kind of unique feature within Palestinian liberation theology that other liberation theologies might not have.
Thank you, Samuel. I mean, such an eloquent and concise summary. Quite a complex idea, but you managed to do that really well. And the phrase that comes to mind is God is always on the side of the oppressed. Many people know that. I think Desmond Tutu used to use that phrase quite a lot within the context of Palestine as well. We are, of course, having this conversation against the backdrop of an escalation in attack on Palestinian Christians by Israelis and, of course, Palestinians in general. According to the Greek Orthodox Church, terrorist attacks by radical Israeli groups targeting churches, cemeteries, and Christian properties have become almost a daily occurrence. Seeing as you are both Jerusalemites, you are now in Jerusalem and have been there throughout the the holidays during Easter. I'd like to ask about your thoughts on what's been happening before we discuss your paper. John.
Yeah, it's an important topic to discuss, especially during the last 2-3 weeks. So we need to begin by saying that the attack on and the threat for the local Christian community here in Palestine is not new. It has indeed has been escalating in recent weeks and months, but already in the Nakba between 47 to 49, we had the displacement of 2/3 of the Christian population from this land. So from the beginning of the Palestinian-Israeli context, we see here a threat on the Christian community. And indeed, throughout the years and with the different discriminatory laws, occupation, apartheid, this has made life for Christians, Palestinian Christians, very, very difficult. And we've seen many, many Christians who are seeking life elsewhere in the Americas and in Europe, trying to escape this context. But what we see in recent weeks, one could say even months, years, is the rise of right-wing religious groups within certain Jewish camps that are very, very hostile towards Christianity. And this has come for many reasons, one of which is that there's certain groups that want to Judaize Jerusalem. They want to Judaize the old city. And how do you Judaize the old city? Well, you have to get rid of those who are not Jews. And one of the main areas that has been under a lot of pressure and attacks is the Christian quarter in the old city of Jerusalem, mainly trying to acquire or take different properties through different deals, and have been working very closely, these right-wing organizations, with the Israeli government. So this is out in the open. This isn't some secret or conspiracy, that there's certain organizations that this is literally their goal, and they have been working closely with the Israeli government. And with the newly established Israeli government, there's even more of a environment which has been allowed for these groups to be and express their anti-Christian sentiments. Now, within Jewish thought, there's a variety of perspectives when it comes to the Christians and Christianity. And of course, this is complicated throughout history within Jewish-Christian relations. But we see that the environment has allowed for more anti-Christian sentiments. And this has been expressed by young Jewish youth either spitting at churches, spitting on Christians, or in worse situations, completely vandalizing a Protestant graveyard in Jerusalem, or actually going into churches, setting a fire or breaking one of the important statues in one of the most important churches in Jerusalem. So we see here a rise of attacks by these young Jewish groups, and the churches have been complaining about this. The churches within the last year have written more statements that have expressed their concern about their situation than they have done in the past 10 years combined. And this is, of course, tied to the threat that they have over a lot of their land, as I mentioned, property within the old city and in Jerusalem that has constantly been trying to be taken over, either by settler type of organizations or the government itself. And during Easter, this Easter and last year's Easter, there was an attempt to restrict the number of Christian worshippers in the Church of Holy Sepulchre, or as we local Palestinian Christians say, the Church of Resurrection, for the Holy Fire ceremony. And this has been done in not the most respectful way. This has been done to restrict people's right to worship and to their right of freedom of religion. And because this has also hurt the churches who are not only Palestinian, but tend to usually be led by international Christians, it's become more within the news, and more statements have been written. But we must remember that Palestinian Christians in Gaza have been denied the right to visit and worship in the Church of Resurrection, and indeed the Church of Nativity during Christmas for years. So on one hand, this is nothing new, but on the other hand, we're seeing a rise and escalation in recent years.
If we can stick to that topic for another question, John, I wanted to ask you, I mean, we've seen a lot of whitewashing when it comes through Israel-Palestine, whitewashing of history, I mean. We know Palestinian Christians played a leading role in the self-determination of the Palestinian population, even the founding of the Palestinian national movement. We know that. And over recent years, Western countries, ostensibly Christian countries, or at least Christian majority countries, have turned a blind eye to the plight of the Palestinian Christians, and contrast that with the fact that Christian Zionism has been on the rise, again conveniently forgetting the plight of their own brothers and sisters in Palestine. So, how does, as a Christian, how does that make you feel? Have you had any solidarity from Western governments, Western Christian institutions, in your plight?
So yeah, I would say that Christian communities and churches have done much more than just turn a blind eye. I think many of these groups, churches, individuals have actively supported the displacement of Palestinian Christians, actively supported the displacement of Palestinian Christians. Some of the biggest supporters of the occupation and of Israeli apartheid are Christians themselves, or, as you have mentioned, Christian Zionism. And Christian Zionism is a very old movement that predates in many ways, Jewish national Zionism, which people often are not as aware of. So when we hear Christians often meet on the street, and we can tell you numerous stories of Christian Zionists coming to us and telling us that we need to leave the land to make room for the Jewish people to come, because we need all the Jews around the world to come to the Holy Land in order for the end times and the second coming of Christ to come faster. And literally Christians have come to us and told us, you do not belong here. You need to leave.
Okay.
This is in the extreme case of a lot of Christian Zionists. But I would say that many, many Christians are, even if they might deep down agree with the fact that Palestinians deserve their human rights, they might not actively pursue it, or they might not actually do anything about it through their governments or local civil society or religious bodies. And this is because, again, Zionism is, at the end of the day, a European movement. And there's been many attempts by Christians to paint this as a cultural war or a religious war, or an alliance, a Judeo-Christian alliance that must be protected, this amazing democracy in the Middle East, and therefore they have remained silent when it comes to the abuse of many Palestinian Christians. And of course, many of them are very, very hesitant because of historical Christian anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. Don't feel that they can actually speak up. On the other hand, you do have many churches, Christians, who do show a lot of support and solidarity to Palestinian Christians, and have actually learned about the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian situation through their exposure to Palestinian Christians. Because we also have to remember that a lot of the pilgrims, a lot of the tourists, they want to meet Christians if they themselves are Christian. Or actually a lot of the tour guides and the tour companies tend to be owned by Palestinian Christians because of this historical relationship between Christian pilgrims and the sort of touring of the holy sites. So you have a mixture of different individuals, communities, churches that either tend to be more pro-Israel, or those who show solidarity with Palestinians. And this is a growing movement, I would say, within the Christian world.
We've had this amazing conversation. We've not even started on your paper yet. And I still have another question before we get to your paper, to be honest with you. So it's worth stressing at the outset, we're discussing a very specific idea of Jesus. There is Jesus as a historical figure. and then there is Christology, the image of Christ as a symbol in Christian theology, which you have both mentioned has been a source of inspiration for people across the world. So I'd like to ask Samuel, where you sit when it comes to Jesus's identity as a historical figure. Some emphasizes Jewishness, others stresses ethnic, geographic Palestinian identity, and the Muslims will say, Jesus submitted to God, therefore he's a Muslim as well, because Muslim essentially means someone who submits to God. So, of course, there's no conflict. He could be, in some ways, all three. Because as I mentioned, someone could be ethnically Jew but practicing Muslim. You could be that as well. That's so. Where do you sit when it comes to Jesus's identity?
I guess I'll share a story which kind of reflects my relationship to the historical figure of Jesus from my own positionality. So it was last summer, and I was sitting on a bench in Jerusalem, and 3 Christian missionaries approached me. And they had an intention to try and pray for me or evangelize me. I'm not sure what it was. And we got chatting. And then they asked me if I'm a Palestinian, and I said yes. And then they asked me if I'm a Christian, and I said yes. And then they asked, when did I convert? Assuming that there are no Palestinian Christians that have been here historically, and that I was previously a Muslim. So I answered them saying, I converted 2,000 years ago. And that kind of shows my own relationship to the historical figure of Christ, or of Jesus, where I view Jesus not only as my spiritual ancestor, but also my physical one, where the early church, the continuous Christian population that resided in Palestine, continues today with the Palestinian Christian community. So in that sense, I view Jesus of history as a part of my heritage, both in a spiritual and physical in terms. Now, the way I personally view the historical figure of Jesus is that there was this person who was very rebellious against the Roman occupation, a Palestinian Jew in the 1st century. Now, having said that, the identity of being a Palestinian Jew in the Second Temple period is very much different to the way we understand Palestinian identity, Jewish identity. It is not a fixed kind of notion, but it's something that gets developed. It's something that changes over time. So it is important to note that aspect of Jesus's historical identity, the history around the figure of Jesus, the Jesus of history. But in my perspective, there was this person who was rebellious to the Roman occupation. He was rebellious towards his own community, who was also oppressive to their own community. And he developed a grassroots movement that led the religious Pharisees at that time and the Romans to want to crucify him, and they crucified him. And they crucified him as a political rebel. And in that sense, I connect to the historical figure of Jesus with today. I see the same, perhaps not identically the same, but I see that there is still an occupation here. There is still oppression here. And this historical figure, apart from my own faith perspective, is an inspiration. It's a role model to be steadfast despite being persecuted, to be steadfast despite being put to death, and to promote values of justice, of compassion, of love, of resistance. So in that sense, that's how I view the historical figure of Christ. And the Jesus of faith is a different subject, though connected. But it's I don't have a monopoly over Christ, and nor do Christians do. The different people can connect to Jesus in different ways, But as a Palestinian Christian whose family's been here over centuries, we root back all the way to the early church, to the day of Pentecost. That's how I connect to the historical figure of Jesus. And I would say that not only Palestinian Christians do, but Palestinians in general connect to this figure of a hero who was martyred because he proclaimed liberation. He proclaimed freedom and justice and compassion. So that's how I connect, and others connect to the history of Jesus, the Jesus of history.
Yeah, that's very, very powerful, and powerful to hear, Samuel. Thank you for that. We've spent quite a lot of time just setting the scene, to be honest, and we've not really, as I said, touched on your paper. So let's talk about your paper and the main claims that you make, John. So what are the key arguments that you're making?
So just to set the scene, in political and popular discourse, you suddenly see many Palestinians, Israelis, internationals suddenly fight over the identity of Christ, right? You have those, many Zionists who may be Christian, Jewish, secular atheists, whoever, make a strong claim, Jesus is a Jew, right? And you hear politicians use it as well. On the other hand, you find a lot of Palestinians, or those who are in solidarity with Palestinians, who say, no, you got this completely wrong. Christ is Palestinian, right? And you hear these two types of claims constantly going back and forth, and you do find some in the middle who say, he can be both a Palestinian and a Jew at the same time. But of course, this is very much seen from the historical perspective. It's being used for political means by these, people who have nothing to do with Jesus, not scholars, not theologians, not even people of Christian faith, who are having this fight over Jesus's identity. So what me and Sam try to do together in this article is we want to look at what do the grassroots movement of Palestinians, how do they identify Christ? That's the first thing that we do. And then the second thing we do is we look at other forms of liberation theology, as Sam laid out so well in the introduction, and how do they relate to Christ? And when me and Sam were looking at different expressions of Christ, whether that be through paintings and drawings, whether that be through icons, whether that be through music, poetry, so on and so forth, we saw that Palestinians identify with Christ because Christ identifies with the oppressed. And Christ not only identifies with the oppressed in general, in this context, he identifies with the Palestinians. So you see many drawings of Christ with a kufiyya, for instance, or Christ, sitting down and eating hummus, or Christ sort of protecting a Palestinian village. So we try to draw as a source. We look at the people and how they relate to Christ, and this is by Christians and Muslims, which is a very important point that we make in our article. And then we look at how the Black liberation theology in the US understand Christ. We focus on the Black liberation movement in the US. And there they also make the same claim that Christ is in deep solidarity and identification with the oppressed. And therefore he takes upon himself their identity, right? He literally becomes one of those who is oppressed. And in the situation of African Americans in the US, they identify him as Black, right? Mm-hmm. So they claim Christ is Black. He's with the oppressed because Black is the identification, is the social marker in the US, which differentiates between those who are considered human and those who are not considered human. And therefore Christ is Black. And this, of course, makes a lot of controversy amongst the white Christians in the US.
Of course.
And then comes a second wave of theologians in the African American context that say, yes, Christ is Black, but he's a Black woman. And this is obviously advanced by African American women, because they believe that Black women are not only oppressed by white supremacists in the US, but also by fellow Black men. And therefore, the real oppressed person is a Black woman. And therefore, Christ is a Black woman. He identifies that much with the oppressed that he takes upon himself their identity, right? They don't mean it literally. They don't believe that Christ was physically, biologically a woman. This is a theological claim. Now, me and Sam take that a step further, because our starting point is how Palestinians relate to Christ, and they relate to him as a Palestinian, right? So then we say that Christ is a Palestinian in this context, in the same way that an African American said that he was Black, right? In this context, the social marker that determines if you're human, non-human, privilege, oppression, is your Palestinian or non-Palestinian identity. So we say Christ is Palestinian. And then we make that further controversial claim that he's in that deep solidarity that he's also a Palestinian woman, because women in our context are also double oppressed by both Zionism and the patriarchy. And then we take it a step further. And this is where we perhaps try to expand on what the African American theologians are trying to do. And we say also there's another social marker, and that is religion. That usually, and I'm speaking in generalization here, Palestinian Christians tend to be more privileged than Palestinian Muslims. This is for a variety of reasons, but also very much because of Islamophobia that has been promoted in the West. And therefore, we claim that Christ is in such identification with the oppressed, or as in Christianity, we say the least of these. Those who are the most oppressed are those who are Palestinian, they're women, and they're Muslim. And we decide to stop it there in that paper. But of course, there's other social markers that we could use, such as class, geography, what type of citizenship you have, physical and mental disability, and so on and so forth. There's different forms of oppression within a context. And we also say, and I think this is an important note, that in some cases, Christ might also be an Ethiopian Jew that's living here in Jerusalem, for instance, and is also being discriminated against in a variety of forms and ways. So again, we want to make sure that we don't have any monopoly over oppression or suffering, and that Christ is with the oppressed regardless to their background.
I mean, we've all seen, anyone who's been following the Palestinian cause, Jesus wearing a kufiya as a represented as a Palestinian, eating hummus. There are other representations as well. I'm wondering, Samuel, if you can elaborate a bit more and speak about the role the image of Christ has played in Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation. I mean, one example comes to mind is maybe Shireen Abu Akleh. She's a Palestinian, she's a woman, and maybe there's images of her as almost a Christ figure. So Shireen Abu Akleh, of course, the journalist who was murdered by Israeli snipers. So what other examples can you cite to highlight the power of the role that the image of Jesus, or the image of Christ, in Christology is playing in Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation?
It's very rich, and it dates back from the 70s, where Palestinian poets and artists have been portraying Christ as a Palestinian. One notable example is the famous cartoonist and artist Naji Ali, who depicts Christ in his cartoons in three different ways: Christ the resistor, Christ the refugee, and Christ the sufferer. And here you can see how there's a sort of projection of the Palestinian national movement, the Palestinian struggle for liberation, onto a universal image of a suffering God, a person who identifies with the oppressed. And in that sense, it not only universalizes, I think, the cause for liberation and perhaps even makes it transnational, but it also connects the message of Christ to the struggle of the Palestinians. And therefore, you see Palestinian Muslims, secular, Christian, depicting Christ in this manner. This is a form of, I guess it could be a political move, but it could also be a religious one. But that's why you see from the 70s and 80s, Christ depicted in this way. And irregardless of what creed or tradition tells you, there's a sort of Palestinian perspective on this figure of Christ. It goes from famous artists and poets like Mahmoud Darwish even has a few poems about Christ on the cross and the meaning of martyrdom and the steadfastness of Christ against the Roman occupation in parallel to the steadfastness against the Zionist crucifixion of Palestinians, to anonymous graffiti artists that you can see when you go into Bethlehem on the apartheid wall. You can see Christ depicted as a Palestinian. And I think, Shireen is again this symbol of, I wouldn't say a Christ-like symbol, but maybe a saint, where there's an example, there's an inspiration, there's a transcendent aspect of her life and martyrdom that connects to all Palestinians. Shireen was a Christian, a woman, and she was in every Palestinian home. And the way she was martyred, the way she lived her life, was a symbol to the Palestinian cause, was a symbol to the beauty of the Palestinian people. And I think in that sense, there's a sort of connection to how the Palestinian Christ has been depicted in the way maybe Shireen has been treated, as these symbols of inspiration, these symbols of martyrs who have been resisting against their occupiers. So in that sense, the Palestinian Christ, John and I, we're not doing anything necessarily new. We're not inventing anything new. This is something on the ground. Of course, we develop it with Black liberation theology, but this is a Christology that has not been yet articulated thoroughly and systematically by Palestinian theologians. So therefore, John and I are trying to make that move. But yeah, and I think Christ will continue to be the symbol of Palestinian indigeneity, of nativeness to the land, and role model for years to come.
So basically, what you're explaining is that theology from bottom up rather than theology from top down, and I get that tension when I read your paper. You mentioned that there's theology in the seminaries secluded from real life versus theology that is on the street, that is alive with the people, and that tension, it plays out in your paper. Would that be a fair assessment? I mean, you mentioned that before, but I wanted to ask you specifically, how have the churches responded to your paper? I mean, it's related to what you've been saying, that there's a theology which is kind of secluded, and theology from the grassroots level on the street that's happening now, which you are basically identifying, giving voice to. But how have the establishment figures, John, responded to this?
So absolutely, for liberation theology and also known as contextual theology has very much been critiquing sort of the hegemonic way of doing theology, specifically in Western seminaries, where some theologians have asked themselves, how many angels dance on a pencil, right? These are the questions that were bothering them. And you have in a movement amongst many theologians who tend to come from the global South, who are critiquing these types of abstract thinking that don't relate to anyone's life, but is only questions that the privileged and comfortable can ask themselves. And a lot of these theologians who come from South Africa, from Latin America, from African Americans, different Dalit communities in India, indigenous communities in North America, so on and so forth, are saying theology shouldn't be done in this sort of abstract place in seminaries where you're comfortable, but actually theology must be done not only with, but for those who are suffering the most. And therefore, what we are trying to promote in this article is that our leading source is not some fancy, white, rich, privileged, male theologian, what they think in their comfortable, heated classrooms in Germany or in the Netherlands or in the UK. What we are taking as our primary source here are the Palestinian people themselves. They become a theological source. And this is because if we take seriously the claim that God is with the oppressed and is in solidarity with the oppressed, and he is working through the oppressed, and he is revealing himself to and through the oppressed, they themselves become a theological source for us to think about and contemplate. And therefore, that is our starting point. Not any commentary, not any fancy book, but the people themselves. And this is what we try to advance in this article, is that theology must be done from the bottom up and not vice versa. And at times it can be very dangerous to do it from the top bottom when there's such a big gap between the communities. And our article is, we're still exploring places for it to be officially published either in a journal or as a book, if we can develop it as a book. But I suspect that many of the church leaders are not going to be very happy. And this is because, unfortunately, a lot of the church leaders are positioned within structures of patriarchy as well, of power and authority, and often forget that their ministry and that Christ himself is in that deep identification with the oppressed. So I suspect that not all of them will be very warm to receive our message, either calling Christ a Palestinian, a woman, or a Muslim, and of course we can continue with those types of identifications. So we have yet to receive that big of a backlash, but this is also because this paper is sort of slowly gaining more exposure.
I would like to add that it's not only a Christology that critiques Zionism and the oppression we Palestinians receive from the West, but it critiques the oppression we Palestinians inflict on one another. And that is something that is more sensitive by perhaps church leaders, by different Palestinian communities. We are challenging Islamophobia. We are challenging the patriarchy. And therefore, this notion of having a Palestinian liberation theology is also, we need to liberate ourselves from the sins and systems that we do that oppress other people. So in that sense, there's another layer to it, which is, it is a criticism and it is a liberation theology towards Zionism in the West, but it's also a criticism and a voice of liberation for within our own community. So it can be multi-layered and therefore more sensitive.
One final question to end on, to both of you, John, Samuel. The theology you described, as you said, it's alive, it's on the ground. Palestinians are living this way of thinking about Jesus. How do you take that to the next level? Do you think the image of Christ, the Palestinian Jesus, as you've portrayed, can be a source of inspiration and empowerment for the Palestinian people in this struggle for justice and liberation? And what are the things that you're doing right now to make that happen, to both of you?
Absolutely. I really believe that Christ and also other religious figures of the past, whether that be the figure of Saint George el-Khadir, who can also inspire and really empower Palestinians to fight for their rights and liberation, because of the huge price that these figures have paid the commitment that these figures have had for the most marginalized and neglected communities. They are absolutely are figures that already inspire, and we see it in Palestinian literature, poetry, imagery, but also will continue to do so. And we are hoping to promote not only within Palestinian theology, but also in different Palestinian scholarship or ways of life, art, so on and so forth, the idea of starting always from the bottom up and not the vice versa. We need to decolonize the way we have been taught to do academia. We need to decolonize the way we understand ourselves. We need to decolonize the ways we understand resistance. We need to decolonize our oppressors, so on and so forth. And we happen to do it in Palestinian theology, but of course, this is relevant for all Palestinians, regardless of their background. Another thing that we're trying to do is to expose and allow for more people to engage into this conversation. And this is the critique that Sam is making, this internal critique towards us. We also need to open it up for more voices within Palestinian discourse. And this is why we have been very active in opening an academic journal of Palestinian Christianity, which is in both English and in Arabic. So if you don't speak English, you can write it in Arabic and vice versa, and we're going to translate some of the articles. So then it's allowing for more voices, more discourse to be in the conversation.
I think the way our Christology, that we're trying to articulate, the Christology that's already been made, it's regardless of, your theological position on it, it's a subaltern image symbol that is against Zionism. From our own Christian positionality, we see this as God identifying with the oppressed. We see God today with the Palestinians, whether it's in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or whether it's in the refugee camps in Jenin, or whether it is in the Holy Sepulchre amongst Christians. We see God there. Jesus is there. I think a second thing is that because God identifies with Palestinians, God identifies with Palestinian women and Muslims, God also fights for their liberation. We are trying to articulate something from our faith, but also something that people can stand by with, all Palestinians who are struggling for liberation. Christ is fighting for you. Christ is there fighting for your freedom. And that is something that I think people can unite, people can relate, people can engage with, despite the limitations that we may have, because this is a very Christian-centric kind of Christology, but theological articulation of Jesus. And I think this idea of God having the identification with the oppressed shows that the oppressors will never have the last say. Even if they kill us, even if they put us in prisons, even if they silence us, they will never have the last say, because the creator of this universe is on our side and is identified with us. And this is hope. This is for us hope in the midst of a nightmare, of a Zionist nightmare that we are living in. And therefore, this image of hope is one way we are conceptualizing decolonization and solidarity. We interpret the commandments within the Christian faith that loving your neighbor means decolonization. And in that sense, I think this image of Christ, this Christology that we are articulating, has something that goes beyond Palestine, beyond Christian theology, but to other oppressed communities around the world, with other people who are being oppressed by the sins and violence of colonialism.
This has been such a fascinating conversation. We could go on and on, but unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time. It's been enriching, enlightening, and I have to say I've thoroughly enjoyed this. So, John, Samuel, thank you very much for joining us. And I hope you at home have also found this enriching and an enjoyable conversation. We'll definitely be keeping an eye on your work, and the topics you've raised, the themes you've highlighted is something that will now be in people's minds and people's imaginations when they look at Palestine. And I hope you've provided different angle and perspective for people to think about when they look about, think and look into the Palestinian issue. So thank you again, and thank you at home for joining us. See you again for another MEMO conversation. Goodbye.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.